Morning. We're continuing to think about relationships this month, and today we're talking about marriage. Marriage is a wonderful thing. I believe God has a great deal in store for us in the context of marriage relationships. There's a lot to look forward to. There's a lot to experience. Proverbs 18:22 says that he who finds a wife finds what is good and receives the favor of the Lord. Now, there are no perfect marriages. I know that from firsthand because although I married a perfect wife, I think, she didn't marry a perfect guy. And so we have a way of getting things out of skew sometimes in our relationships. And so there's no perfect marriage, but there are a lot of marriages that are in the process of being perfected. There's always a lot of hope and a lot of room to grow in our marriages. Marriage is not a science. You cannot turn it into an equation that says if you'll do this and then this and then this, everything will be good. It doesn't work that way. Nor can any marriage be replicated. We can say, well, my parents had a great marriage or my friends have a great marriage. If I just do what they did, then everything will be okay. It doesn't work that way. Any more than you can relive a day. You can't go back to tomorrow and relive it, whether it was a good day or change it if it was a bad day. So in the same way, every marriage is unique, and every day is a new adventure in this thing called marriage. As a culture, we're really trying to understand what marriage is. Marriage seems to be changing a lot in our culture today. And for the most part, I think we're struggling as a culture to figure out what marriage really is. But God established and ordained marriage, and I believe if we follow His ideas, His principles on what marriage is, we're going to find that it's a blessing that God has given us to experience marriage. What is marriage? What is a Christian marriage? What does that look like in our life? Now, two Christians being married does not make a Christian marriage. I'm sorry to tell us that. In the same way, some people would say marriage is made in heaven. Well, you know what? So is thunder and lightning. And so just because you have two Christians married doesn't mean everything's going to go just swimmingly along. According to Stats Canada, in 2012, these are some of the latest statistics that are available to us, there were 71,000 divorces in Canada last year. 43% of all marriages, they say, will not make it to their 50th anniversary. Focus on the Family conducted a survey some time ago, and they found that 79% of husbands and wives held that maintaining a good, stable marriage was one of their top priorities in life. And 83% said that they wanted their elected leaders to make strong and encouraging families one of their primary concerns. And so this weekend, we're celebrating the first family holiday in our province. And I think it's a good thing to be able to set apart a day to focus on our families and the importance of families in our lives. 78% of people said that the importance of family life was undervalued in Canadian society today, and that 73% strongly rejected the suggestion that marriage was an outdated institution. I think that's a good message too. Ultimately, we believe as a people that marriages are important and valued, and families are valued. That's a good thing. Sometimes we struggle with how to make it happen. That's a normal thing. Study after study shows that cohabitation is, in fact, far less stable of a relationship than marriage is. To cite one example of a study that was done by the University of Montreal. Researchers there found that children born in a common law couple in Quebec were 4 times more likely to see their parents separate by their 6th birthday. Even the latest statistics that came out of Stats Canada in the study that was just released recently, they showed that cohabitation, common law relationships, were far less stable than marriage relationships. There was a major study that was done by Barna Research that found that professing Christians don't make better marriages, necessarily. That 27% of those describing themselves as born-again Christians had currently been or had previously been divorced. That was compared to about 24% of the general population. So, the message there is, we don't do any better than the average. Really. Christian marriages are just as likely to split up as non-Christian marriages. So, why is this? What is this thing called marriage? What's the purpose of this Christian marriage? And how do we build it so that it can last through the storms of life? Because we're all going to experience those storms. Is it simply 2 people who enjoy being together? They like one another? And so they want to be together for the rest of their lives? Is that what it takes to have a good, healthy marriage? Perhaps they want to, perhaps they love one another, whatever that might mean. Because it has lots of definitions depending upon the day and the mood and the attitude of the day. Jesus said of marriage, when he was asked if it was okay for people to divorce, he said this in Matthew 19. Starting in verse 4, he said, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the 2 will become one flesh. So they are no longer 2, but they are one. Therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate.' Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her on his way?" And Jesus replied, "Because your hearts are hardened. You're going to do what you want to do anyway. But that's not the way it was designed to work. That's not what the Father had in mind. That's not the purpose of marriage." He says 2 people are to become one. Now this is a great mystery for sure. How 2 individuals become one. How most couples spend their entire life discovering what that means and how you actually live that out. That's part of the journey of marriage. That's part of the mystery and the discovery of marriage. And it's not an easy process. Ecclesiastes 4:12 says, "Though one may be overpowered, and 2 can defend themselves, a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken." God intends to be an integral part of this marriage relationship. And this oneness comes about by the man and the woman changing to become a person that looks more like God. Because it is in God that unity is found. We think that if we just live the way we live and we find somebody that kind of likes the way we live and we kind of like the way they live, then we'll kind of sort it out and get it together. And it doesn't work that way. Marriage forces us to change in every aspect of who we are in order for us to become one. Well, there's a number of things that we can learn about this idea of becoming a marriage that lasts long, that goes the distance. And as Sylvia was talking about how the book of Acts was kind of coming on alive to her in a new way, the book of Ruth did some similar things with me as I was thinking about this marriage, this topic of marriage. Ruth is not necessarily a book that we look to for marriage teaching, but it has a whole lot to say about what it takes to build a marriage relationship that is going to last and make a difference in generations to come. One of the first things we discover in the story of Ruth and Boaz is that godly marriage is built on a foundation of who God has made you to be. What you bring to the marriage. Because marriage is built on the foundation of your character. Who you are. At any point in time. Ruth 1:16 says, Ruth replies, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I'll go, and where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with it ever be so severely, if anything but death separates you and I." Now this passage, it's a beautiful passage. And I've heard it read many times in marriage ceremonies. But Ruth isn't talking to Boaz there. Ruth is talking to Naomi. And Ruth was not marrying Naomi. But this tells us a whole lot about the character of Ruth, doesn't it? It demonstrates these character qualities of faithfulness and commitment. When Ruth's sister-in-law, Orpah, kisses Naomi goodbye, Ruth clings to her in verse 14. Orpah and Ruth had both been in a bad situation. They both had lost their husbands. They were both left with a mother-in-law whose husband had also died. That was devastating to an ancient people group. And Orpah was going to do what seemed best for her. She was going to go back to the family, to the people, to the culture, to the religion, to the ways of life that she knew, that she relied on to help her make it through this difficult time of her life. She was going to do what was best for her. I mean, she cared about Naomi. She loved Naomi. She was sad to leave Naomi, but still, she was going to do what seemed to be best for her. Ruth took a very different approach. Ruth was committed to Naomi and to helping her. She says, "Where you go, I'll go." What that means is Naomi was going to set the direction and the destination for their life. Ruth was going to go wherever Naomi said to go. She says, "Where you stay, I will stay." There's a commitment there to share her home, to share her circumstances of her life. Whatever comes our way, I'm in it with you, Naomi. No matter how hard this might be, Ruth knew that the likelihood of living a nice, comfortable life with Naomi was pretty slim. The likelihood of that was not high. A comfortable life was not on her horizon for the most part. But for the sake of Naomi, she was going to love her, to help her, to live with her, to be with her. She was going to take on the challenge of adapting and adopting a new family, a new people, a new faith. It was a complete renunciation of a formal way of living. She was leaving her old way of life. Naomi's character and the way of life during the years in Moab must have been so impressive to Ruth that it would cause Ruth to be willing to abandon her homeland and her gods and her way of life. But Ruth was embracing Yahweh, the God of the Bible, wholeheartedly. And she was making a sacred vow to love and to live with Naomi for the rest of her life. I have to tell you, that makes a tremendous statement when we're talking about marriage. I'm going to go with you wherever it goes. I'm with you no matter how good or hard it gets. I'm with you regardless. Come what may, there ain't nothing leaving me, causing me to leave you. That's not the way most of our world looks at marriage. This tells us something about Ruth's character. And it prepared her beautifully for marriage. She was going to be faithful in every area of her life. You cannot be faithful to your career and become lazy to another area of life. You cannot be faithful to this part of your life and lazy to this part of your life and be considered a faithful person. It's when we're faithful to all areas of our life. That's when it becomes a character quality. That's when it becomes who I am. We learn more about Ruth in the 2nd chapter. And I encourage you guys, this morning, we can't cover all of this book this morning, but I encourage you to this afternoon, go home, read the book of Ruth. It's only 4 chapters. It takes you about 10 or 15 minutes. It's not a long thing, but it is an incredible story. And I really encourage you to read it. But in the 2nd chapter, Ruth embodies humility and a willingness to work and to work hard. If we look at Ruth 2, verses 2 and 3. It says, "And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor.' And Naomi said to her, 'Go ahead, my daughter.' So she went out and began to glean the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech." Life and marriage require work ethic, strong work ethic. Anyone who's been married for a while will tell you a good marriage takes a lot of work. And Ruth's work ethic and her commitment, her desire, her willingness to work translates into all these different areas. We're called to work physically, relationally, emotionally, spiritually in our lives. There's no room for laziness. Only rest. And then the Father gives us Sabbath with Him and with one another. Boaz was also a man of character. He had a genuine concern for people. He had this character quality of a word that we don't really use much today, and when we do use it today, it really has a connotation of something entirely different than what the word actually means. It's this quality of charity. And charity is this genuine, he genuinely cared for the welfare of others. A man who genuinely cared about people. In Ruth 2, verses 4 and 9, it says, "Just then Boaz arrived in Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. 'The Lord be with you.' 'The Lord bless you,' they called back." You see, Boaz noticed and cared for the people who were working for him. He recognized that there were other people a part of his life. Verse 5, it goes on, it says, "Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, 'Who's that young woman? Whose young woman is that?' And the foreman replied, 'She's the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." And she went into the fields and has worked steadily from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter.' So Boaz said to Ruth, 'My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in anyone else's field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled.'" He genuinely cared for this woman. He didn't know who Ruth was, not until just moments before this conversation. But he saw a young woman who was working hard, and she was following after the harvesters. Now, there was a tradition in the Israelite custom, in the ancient customs of the world that day, that the owner of a field would tell his harvesters not to harvest the edges and the corners of a field. All of the edges and all the corners of the field were left for the poor and the foreigners who were in the area. They would take everything else in the middle, but they left traditionally something for those who were less fortunate. And that's where Ruth was gleaning. That's what she was taking. So he recognized her as a foreigner, someone who was poor, who had nothing. And he saw that she was working, and she was working hard. And he cared for her. He was willing to support her. He was willing to help her. He was willing to provide some security for her. He says, I've told the other guys to leave their hands off of you. Don't bother you. And you can drink from the water that they're going to gather. You don't have to go pull up the water yourself out of the well. Let them get your water. Go ahead and work. Boaz was a man who trusted God to be good as well. He looked to God and pointed to his relationships to rely upon God. In verse 12 of chapter 2, he says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings that you have come to take refuge." He had heard about Ruth by this point in time. Her reputation had preceded her. And he knew that she'd come with Naomi, that she had rejected the gods of Moab and had embraced Yahweh. And he encouraged her in that and said, trust in God. He's going to be good to you. Take refuge in Him. Boaz also began to protect and provide for Ruth. In verses 14 to 16, it says, at mealtime Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread, dip it in the wine vinegar. And when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all that she wanted, and she had some left over. As she got up to glean, to go back to work, Boaz gave orders to his men. Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull some stalks out for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. But don't rebuke her. He was genuinely looking out for her best interest. He cared. Here's a word to the men here. Guys, your wives should be flourishing under your care and love of your relationships, of your marriages. They should be flourishing emotionally and physically, spiritually. Do they feel like they're flourishing? Would they say they're flourishing under your care? They've been placed by God under your care, and you will have to give yourself to them in order for them to flourish. You cannot provide all that they're going to need, and you weren't designed to. But in those times when it's beyond what you can give, the words aren't there for you to soothe their hearts or their minds. Do you point them to God? Do you point them to the relationship and allow God to bring into that relationship what you lack? Both Ruth and Boaz proved to be people of good character. There was integrity in their lives. What they said and what they did was congruent. That's what integrity is. What I intend to do and what I actually do are the same. There was a faithfulness in their lives. There was humility. There was a respect for hard work. They cared about and they cared for other people. There was a track record of character in their lives, and it was proven by their reputation. And they were trusting God for their lives and for their relationships. This sets a great foundation for a healthy marriage. A Christian marriage is built on the foundation of our personal character. And God desires us to look more and more like Him as we live that out, especially in our marriages. There's a verse that Paul wrote out of Romans 12. Verses 2, it says, "Do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world." Don't try to make your marriage look like all the other marriages in this world. Don't try to make your marriage look like the marriage on TV. Please. Don't try to make your marriage look like the marriage in magazines. Please. Don't try to make your marriage look like the marriage of your friends down the street. Don't try to make your marriage look like the marriages of this world. Do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed, but be changed. Internally changed. By the renewing of your mind, the way you think, the way you look at the world, the way you look at your marriage, the way you look at your spouse, the way you look at yourself, the way you look at God. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, because you see, God is able to change the way we think about life, the way we think about relationships, the way we think about marriages. And then Paul gives us great promise. He says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, perfect, pleasing will. You'll be able to live out what God's best for your life is. You'll be able to know what God's best looks like in this world where you and I live today. And it will be good. It will be pleasing. It will actually work. It will make sense. It will be satisfying. Many conflicts in marriage will be resolved if we would implement this principle. I've done lots of premarital counseling, and I've done a fair bit of marital counseling over the way. And I can tell you that the majority of problems that marriages have is because someone doesn't want to change who they are and how they live. They want the other person to change, but they don't want themselves to change. That creates problems. Things don't just come together. There's not a lot of oneness there. You see what I'm saying? Christian marriage is a new way of serving. Our marriages would be revolutionized if we approached marriage as servants and not as recipients. Most people enter into relationships, and particularly marriages, for what they can get out of this marriage. How it's going to satisfy their desires. How it's going to accomplish their goals. How it's going to make them feel good about who? Themselves. That's how most people enter into marriage relationships, as recipients. But Ruth was a servant to Naomi, and Boaz could see that in her character. Later on in the story of Ruth, in chapter 3, in verse 9, Boaz asks Ruth, "Who are you?" he asks. Ruth says, "I am your servant, Ruth. I'm here to serve you. I'm here to make your life all it can be." It's not so hard for us to understand the oneness of a relationship when we have a need. And that's how we end up taking one another for granted in these relationships, because we're expecting the other to understand my feelings, and to, particularly, if at all possible, to understand my feelings intuitively, so that they can meet my needs, or at the minimum, give me room to meet my need on my own. And we can easily get caught up in our own life, and our own life's miseries, and completely lose sight of our first role in a relationship, which is to serve the other. When we serve the other, we look for ways to ease their load. to make their load easier. I can clean the kitchen for Diana when she's tired, and I can ease the load that she may be feeling of a long day. That means I'm aware of her life and what she's going through and what she's experiencing and the load that she's actually carrying. Christian marriage is also a new way of loving. Love is more than a romantic, tingly feeling. Tingles will come and tingles will go. But real love must go on every day in the trenches of life. Love is love when it is lived out more than it's felt. An interesting thing about the story of Ruth and Boaz is they enter into this marriage relationship, which they do towards the end of this book. I found this really interesting. The word love does not show up in the book of Ruth. Nowhere. The word love is not there. But it is written on every paragraph throughout the entire book. It shows up in actions. That's what love is. It's lived out. Now, yes, we need to hear it occasionally from one another. But we need to see it. We need to experience it much more than we need to hear it. A Christian marriage is a deeper level of acceptance as well. In verse 10 of chapter 3, Boaz says this. He says, "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." It's a new level of acceptance. Because we live in real life, it's easy to let the circumstances of life and our own twistedness influence how we accept one another. We look for all the wrong things in all the wrong places, for all the wrong reasons. Our culture places a high amount of value on appearance and image. What we look like, the shape of our bodies, how we dress, how we act. We place a lot of importance upon that. We look to the surface because it's the easiest place for our hearts to get captivated. I want to end with a story. This is a story of a young man who had been at war. And he reads a book, and his heart is captivated. It goes like this. At 5:54 p.m., Lieutenant John Blanford stood in Grand Central Station with his heart racing. In just 6 brief minutes, he would meet the woman who had captured his heart. He had never seen her with his eyes, but his heart knew her through the words that she had written. It all started when he picked up a book in the Army Library of human bondage. It was littered with personal notes in the margins. Now, he had always hated the practice of writing in books, but these remarks seemed to seize his heart. He found the name Hollis Maynell in the bookplate and began to search for the woman for whom he'd been so attracted. When he secured her address, he wrote her, and she responded. And for the next 13 months, they had corresponded. But she refused every request to send a photograph. She explained, "If your feelings for me has any reality, any honest basis, what I look like won't matter. When you come to New York, you shall see me and make your decision. Remember, both of us are free to stop or to go on after that, whichever we choose." They had agreed that she would wear a red rose on her lapel to identify her among the sea of travelers. At 1:06, he spotted a beautiful young woman moving towards him. His heart leaped. She was young, slender, blonde. He started moving toward her without noticing she was not wearing a red rose. She gave him a provocative smile and asked, "Going my way, soldier?" He took one step closer and then noticed Hollis Maynell. Hollis Maynell was standing. She was just a few feet behind the beautiful young lady. A red rose on the lapel of a woman clearly past her 40s, with graying hair tucked under a worn hat and thick ankles thrust into low-heeled shoes. As the attractive young woman strolled away, Blandford felt as though he were being torn in two. He wanted to follow the beauty that he'd seen, yet it was the words of this unattractive woman that had so completely captured his heart. He responded as he felt he should, and gripped the worn blue copy of the Book of Human Bondage that would identify him to her. He realized that he would share with this woman, what he would share with this woman would not be love, but it would be something special. They had established a friendship for which he was most grateful, and with a twinge of disappointment, he squared his shoulders, saluted, held out his book, and said, "I'm Lieutenant John Blandford, and you are Miss Maynell. I'm so glad to meet you. May I take you for dinner?" The woman extended a tolerant smile and remarked, "I don't know what this is all about, son. The young lady who just went by, she begged me to wear this rose on my coat. She said that if you asked me to go out with you, that I should tell you that she's waiting for you in the big restaurant across the street." Ruth ends up becoming the great-grandmother of David, the king of Israel. And when David is a young man, about to be selected to become king by the prophet Samuel at the direction of God, Samuel begins to look at all the brothers of David. He sees the strong, he sees the mighty, he sees the smart, he sees the outgoing, he sees the best that the world might have to offer. But God says, no. Get the young, ruddy one that's out with the stinky sheep. 1 Samuel 16:7, God says, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. At some point along the way, all of us are going to have to rely upon that verse in our marriages, because there will be times that you'll be ready to jump ship and go for someone else who's better looking, got more money, got more opportunity, less problems, less issues, whatever. And God will say, no. Are you going to be faithful? Are you going to be committed? Are you in this for the long run? Are you letting me change you? Or are you just changing your circumstances and thinking I'm blessing you? Being a Christian does not give any one of us instant marital success. It's just as hard for a Christian couple to be married as a non-Christian couple. All deal with the same struggles, the same fears, the same expectations, the same unfulfilled expectations. However, when we pursue building the character of Christ into our lives, like qualities of faithfulness and commitment and humility and service and hard work, a willingness to look to God to be good and to provide for the needs of our spouse so they can flourish in our marriages, we'll find healthy marriages growing. And they'll be going the distance. And our hearts will be satisfied. Let's pray together. Father, thank you that you desire more for us than we desire for even for ourselves. God, I thank you that you desire for us to experience healthy marriages that will make a difference and will go the distance. And Father, I thank you that in the midst of building healthy marriages, you are ultimately changing each one of us. You're shaping us. You are renewing us. You are making us look different, act different, live differently, so that we may be the men and women that you've called us to be, that you created us to be, and live in the marriages that you intend to bless us with. So that we may know you greater. We may experience your love in fresher ways than ever before. Father, I pray that you would bless the marriages in our church. I pray that you would protect them. I pray that you would allow the husbands and the wives in these marriages to let you be shaping them and changing them. Father, I pray the same thing for the single people in our church. Those who would want to be married, would desire to be married. Father, I pray that you would encourage them to be men and women who are letting you change them and shape them and make them into men and women who will bring marriages together that will flourish and live well. Father, I pray for people in our church who have felt the pain of a marriage that has broken apart. And God, I pray that you would meet them at the point of their need, that you would bring healing into their hearts and into their minds, into their souls. And Father, I pray that you would continue to shape them into the character of Christ, that you would change them in the way that they think, in the way that they look at life and love and other people and marriages and relationships. God, I pray that you would change each of us, all of us, so we might look more like Christ and His character in our world today. So that when we stand out to a world, we have something to offer. And what we offer is the light of life. So Father, help us. Encourage us. Bless us. Help us to be the people that you've called us to be. We might have marriages that are built to last. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. This morning, as we sing these next couple of songs, I would encourage you to spend some time praying, asking the Lord to bless you, to do the work that He needs to do in your life, in your marriage. You can come up here and use this bench. I think Della's going to be up here and she'll pray with anyone who wants someone to pray with them. Or if you want to pray where you're at, use this as an opportunity to respond to the Lord in whatever way you need to respond to the Lord this morning.